Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benton Glaze. I'm one of the board members of the Northwest chapter of the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists. And over the course of the last couple of years, we've heard from our membership that sometimes there's some difficulty in being able to make some meetings and uh, get all of the CEUs needed to maintain membership in the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists. So, as a board, we've discussed this over the course of the last several meetings or so, and we decided that we would try and do some webinars for our membership and hopefully be able to offer some information that's relevant to kind of the beef and livestock industries kind of throughout the year, and also give people an opportunity to get some CEUs for the ARPAS credits. So that's the purpose of the webinar here this afternoon, and we have a couple of speakers that we're going to allow to provide some information, and we'll go through each one of the speakers, give them a chance to speak here this afternoon. And then following each one of those presentations, we'll have a little bit of time for questions. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Van Emon is an extension beef cattle specialist at Montana State University, and she's been there in that role since 2014. Her research at Montana State University focuses on the supplementation strategies, also cow-calf production, water quality, and bull development. Dr. Van Emon's research and extension programs focus on ruminant nutrition and improving beef cattle production in Montana and throughout the United States. And this afternoon, we've asked her to come and present some information on cattle fly control and management. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Van Emon.
Thanks, Benton. I'm going to attempt to share some. Oh, where'd they go? Let me see. Try and share slides, I guess. Okay, that's screen one. I don't use Zoom, so it's always a. Okay, let me get the slideshow going here. Can you see the slides now?
We can see the slide, yes.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. I hope the fly year isn't going too bad for everyone. I know we're just starting here in Montana to really start see our fly season. I guess in one aspect, when it's dry out, you're a little bit lucky that flies may not be your biggest concern, but we've had some rain here recently and it has started. Um, so we'll kind of get into some control methods and then maybe walk through some species and how they're impacting production as well. So basic things for flies in general. Usually we see that reduced production, whether that's milk production, whether it's in that feed efficiency for some of those calves, especially in the feedlot settings, and potentially reduced body weights, especially at weaning time for those calves that have gone through a pretty bad fly season there. And that's all due to reduced feed intake because they're spending more time trying to fight those flies. Then dehydration, just in the fact if we do get some severe fly numbers going on, that they're not able to consume their water intake, as well as then the potential biting flies there, causing some dehydration issues, and then ultimately reductions in that immunity as well as reproduction, ultimately leading to those economic losses, whether at the weaning time or in reduced pregnancy rates. So typically there's 4 types of flies. The house fly, which we're commonly dealing with this time of year in the houses, but also stable flies, horn flies, and face flies are those 3 species that are pretty common with our cattle and livestock. And all 3 have kind of play different roles in what they're impacting on those calves and those cows. So stable flies, I don't know if it was like this everywhere, but probably, I think it was 2 years ago now, We had a horrible stable fly season, mainly in those cows that were grazing during some old hay yards, old hay feeding areas. And that was because those stable flies lay their eggs in that decaying organic matter and they start to come up. So those winter hay feeding areas were a pretty good propagation because although we had been in a drought for the previous, depending on who you ask, 2, 3 years, those hay feeding areas still did have some organic matter left over, hadn't been picked clean. And then we had a really wet, cool beginning to the spring and summer, and it led to stable fly population. So those flies typically land on the front legs and the belly side. So that was those cows that were spent a lot of time in the water sources. Saw a lot of cattle out in reservoirs just trying to protect those legs and the belly from those flies because they're biting. I don't know if anybody was out there when you were working cows, but I know I got bit by a couple just from working cows, and those bites do not feel very good. They caused a pretty good sized welt, and really the egg to adult stage is between 14 to 24 days. So we can see some pretty long periods of time where those stable flies can be an issue. Typically, they are disrupting those grazing patterns because they're either standing in water. Those cattle are bunching up, trying to reduce that surface area for those flies to bite. They spend a lot of time stomping those legs around. We also ended up with quite a few calves, as well as cows with very swollen joints, just from the constant stomping, trying to get those legs moving and getting those flies disrupted so they could keep grazing. This ultimately leads to that reduction in weight gain, primarily with those calves, but also seeing some of those cows because they're spending so much time stomping and not grazing, and therefore we can also see some milk production issues. But they are a blood-sucking fly species. Like I said, they cause some pretty significant welts, and kind of that economic threshold is right about 5 flies per leg, where we would want to see some treatment going on. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of treatment options for stable flies where it is labeled for that fly species. Um, but they do cause a pretty good disruption to those cows and calves. So some previous work that was done looking at stable flies where they kind of established that 5 fly per leg economic threshold, they saw a reduction of about 0.2 of a pound per head per day in average daily gain, or about an 8% reduction. It doesn't seem like a lot when you think about it on some of those smaller calves. However, if that stable fly season's 90 days long, we might only see that reduction in 20 pounds or so of those weaning weights. Once again, doesn't seem like a lot until we put it on more of an economic threshold, especially with calf prices nowadays this year. So if we take some of these calves that, that were treated for stable flies weighing at about 575 at weaning time versus those that were untreated and only weighing about 560, and we're talking, $300 a hundredweight or even more on some of those smaller calves, that can tend to be only about a $48 per head difference, not accounting for anything else. And if they're getting the same price, but we put that over 100 calves, you're almost $5,000 difference on 100 calves. Um, and so that can cause a pretty big deficit in that economic threshold there with not treating for those stable flies. We'll get into some control methods for all the fly species here in a little bit, but once again, thinking about there's not a lot of treatment options out there for stable flies. Primarily looking at sprays and things, and they needed to be sprayed weekly, which was kind of the most effective treatment because most of our fly tags are not labeled for that fly species. So we're kind of using some different methods there. So then we're talking increased labor and things like that as well. So just a few little things while we're right here. Like I said, the weekly application, for those that were more in like a dry lot scenario where we tend to have more impacts from stable flies in those dry lots because of that organic matter decaying, We can try and spray the ground. However, once again, requires quite a bit of labor as well as then purchase of the product. So we have those options such as Kumafos, the permethrins, natural pyrethins, and Fosmet. There are products available, but once again, most of them are sprays. And I don't know about you guys, but going out and trying to spray 100 head of cows and calves out on the pasture where they're all spread around, or even just trying to gather them into a single location is really time consuming, especially right now, right? We're getting hay cut down, so we're having to kind of take away from some things to add labor to other things. So there is a feed through available, such as Clarifly. However, it just stops those larvae from maturing, so we have to make sure we're feeding that at the correct time frame. Keeping those lots clean, or cleaning up that organic matter, getting it to dry out, can really help control stable flies. And then, right, fly traps, which we all have probably around the barn. However, getting them out in the middle of a pasture in those organic matter areas probably isn't the easiest and most functional control. So horn flies are kind of the ones we typically treat for every year with our fly tags. They land on the back, shoulders, and sides, sometimes on the top of the head there. They will begin to move to the belly towards the heat of the day. And very similar to those stable flies, as those eggs are laid in the manure and then will hatch within 1 to 2 days with a life cycle of, 2 to 3 weeks still. They're also blood sucking, but this is kind of our biggest concern on the economic side, because if you have a severe hornfly population, you can see up to $1 billion in economic losses throughout the United States in a year because of the losses from those hornflies. And about 200 flies per animal is kind of our economic threshold for treatment. So we kind of have to, unfortunately, you have to let them kind of get thick enough before you start those treatments, because everything has a time limit and when they're most effective, depending on what treatment method you're using. So just to kind of give you an idea of just a visual of how to measure fly populations for those kettle and the hornfly species. So the top one, right, is, I would say, is kind of that early season where we really aren't considering economic threshold for treatment. And then as those bunches kind of start to grow together and it becomes more of a solid band across the entire back, as well as shoulder area, we're between this 3 and 4 here is where we're really going to want to consider what treatments are available and what are we going to use to help those cows out. Because I don't know about you guys, I always get a lot of questions about fly control, especially this time of year. And it's really hard to judge, so kind of having this visual to at least kind of help some producers out on estimating those numbers, because I don't want to go out and try and count flies on all the cattle out there. So just kind of using this as a visual to help them, the producers, understand where we need to maybe consider some treatment options. So once again, some previous research here looking at calf weaning weights, because that, in the end, on the western side of the states here, is where our ultimate kind of paycheck comes from, is those weaning sales. So if we have our untreated at a little over 500 pounds and our treated calves weighing 540, once again, $300 a hundredweight, calves are going to be a hot commodity again this fall. So really, that's $108 difference between those two calves, and over that 100 calves, right, again, is about $11,000. So that's just raw cost once again, but just to kind of give you an idea of where that could see some production losses just on the weaning weight side of things. This doesn't really account for any reproductive losses where those those cows and those potential heifer replacements maybe fighting those flies off and having some reduced preg rates as well. So horn flies, I guess, fortunately have a lot of control methods that are labeled for that. Dust bags, oilers, kind of our primary is those ear tags. You can do some sprays, pour-ons, as well as those feed additives. I would say ear tags are probably our most common method. The big one with those is just getting them out there at the correct time period when we're reaching those economic thresholds to make sure they're the most effective in following those label directions. Now, phase flies are kind of a different game we're playing here, and yes, they're causing those cows to potentially reduce their grazing time because they're blinking. They're causing that eye watering because they are landing on the face, especially in that eye area, because those flies feed on those eye secretions. Once again, eggs are laid in the manure with about a 3-week life cycle. And tend to cluster more in pastures that have some shady areas and waterways. But we all know there's also those times where they are out in those tall grasses as well. And just to give you an idea, about a dozen phase flies can reduce that grazing time for about an hour. But our biggest detriment is that it will transmit pink eye from calf to calf. That's kind of our biggest concern with these phase flies. The cows, yes, we want to treat them and make sure that they are continuing their production, but it's those calves where we could potentially see some eye loss there with the blindness or just the scarring, and then the treatment for pink eye itself. So pink eye, which is what we'll kind of focus on due to those phase flies, which is usually caused by that Marxella bovis, but it can survive up to 4 days on those phase flies. So one phase fly could spread it to a large number of calves. And it really can cost us about $150 million in annual loss of production just due to that treatment cost, reductions in weight gain in that milk production if we are seeing those heavy infestations, and those calves being about 20 pounds lighter at weaning. So just using a very similar example as we have the last two species, but if we're talking, 20 pounds at $3 a pound, so that's about a $60 difference, so about $6,000 in difference between treated and untreated. So you start adding all of these things up, and then plus the potential for the additional treatment cost on this, those treated calves for the phase flies, or at least the cows for those phase flies having better weaning weighted calves, can really come into a big play here if we aren't treating that, and compared to those calves from cows that were not treated. So, like I mentioned before, we have several management options. Fly tags kind of being our number one use, I would say, but we also have those feed throughs. I have a lot of producers around here that use the dusters and the oilers. Or the back rubbers. You can also try and use some pour-ons. We also have some injectables that are available as well, but once again, it depends on kind of what your labor situation is, and what's going to be the most economical. There's also some products where you can stick some insecticide strips on the ear tags themselves, not necessarily a fly ear tag, but ones that actually hook around their current ear tags, or those where they have to stick their head into the mineral tub with those insecticide strips, so it gets on the face and they can spread it around to the body that way. But the biggest issue on the horn fly side of control is we're running into some resistance problems. And that's because, honestly, there's just not been a lot of new products available. We're reworking, we're still using the same type of active ingredients. And so it's really focusing in on which products you're using with those active ingredients each year to help us reduce that resistance in those horn fly populations. So the biggest thing about flies in general is they will move between herds, and they can be fairly distanced away. And the biggest concern is, if you're doing your job as a producer and treating those flies, but your neighbor is not, those flies then will, from the untreated herd will move back into your herd as well. So maybe having that conversation if you've got cows, whether they're neighboring fences, or maybe you're grazing in common, and making sure everybody's on that same page and seeing how we're going to treat these fly populations. And so everybody's doing the same management. Um, Another one that's just additional labor, especially on those dust bags and the back rubbers and the oilers, is just making sure they're charged, ready to go, and making sure we continuously have those available. Um, Biggest challenge with our feed intake or our feed throughs is that we can see variable intake depending on the year. Like Benton and I were talking about earlier, it was dry here. I know there's a few up kind of north of Miles City where I'm at, where they're still very dry. And so are those cows consuming more mineral, or maybe the optimum amount of mineral that have these feed throughs in it compared to cows that are in a more moisture-rich environment, which hasn't been Montana this year, and I know most of the West is in a drought. Um, and are those cows consuming the correct amount every day? The sprays and the pour-ons tend to require that retreatment, so they need to be in an area where you can gather or at least get to every cow and get those sprays put on them. And, some cows you're probably going to be able to walk right up to and spray. I know a lot of producers, a couple years ago when we were dealing with the stable flies, they ran the cake truck out, dropped some cake, brought everybody in as best they could because they were able to get to those cows, and then they drove by them with a four-wheeler sprayer and sprayed all of them down. So that we do have some treatment options there, but once again, labor, time, all of these things are coming into play. And then the mist sprayer, especially on a dry lot, may be a little more convenient, but it does require those weekly treatments. So we all have to consider these options as we're considering our fly control methods every year. Just threw this on here as just some other parasites and considerations throughout the summer. Our coccidiosis, depending on how wet of an environment you're in, that's usually where we can run into these issues. But then our worms, especially on lush green grass, potentially along like streams and creek bottoms and everything, we could run into some worm issues there. Grubs, mites, and lice. Lice is a wintertime parasite we typically worry about, and I noticed this year, at least here, was a little bit more heavy lice population than we've seen in the last few years, and usually tends to deal with how that weather is playing out. And I would like to say we got really extremely cold, but we did for a couple of weeks, but then tended to be, I would say, a little bit above average. So that could have played an issue on our lice population. But all of those treatment methods, sometimes we can also get some injectables depending on what we're treating for, what those reapplication times are to be most effective. But then I also like to throw out there, what is the withdrawal time on that product, especially those pour-ons, where we're turning, let's say, bulls out or something like that, and we're giving them a treatment before we turn them out to breed those cows. And let's say one of those bulls comes up lame, or has an injury within that first couple of weeks, and we haven't reached that withdrawal period based on that pour-on. So just keeping that in mind before, especially if it's an injury that they're not going to recover from, and we either ultimately sell them, or take them to a harvesting facility to get burger or what have you made out of that product. So moving into a few more specifics on control methods, as we walk through the pour-ons, I would say very typical, and especially our lice treatments. We do use it a little bit in the fly side of things, but making sure we're providing the correct dose, checking the weights of those cows, bulls, calves, whatever you're going to spray, and making sure you put it down the midline of the back. And checking that withdrawal time again. Also, wear gloves, your proper protective equipment while you're using a lot of these. Because I know I'm the first person, we're working cows, we're pouring them. I'm the first, the cow stops in the chute and you're trying to get her out. You touch her on the back or, give her a good pat on the butt. and I get my hand covered in the pour-on. So, but on the positive side, haven't had any bug issues. So, just throwing that out there, but making sure you're wearing that protective equipment. Dust bags, putting them in those commonly used areas, by a water source, mineral tub, what have you, where they're commonly using it every single day, where they have to walk through that dust bag apparatus, I guess is the way to say it. So it gets on them. Otherwise, they aren't going to be able to get treated very well for those flies. And checking them as often as you can. It's nice to be checked weekly just to make sure those bags are staying recharged. General recommendation, though, is only about 25 to 30 head per dust bag. So making sure you've got those distributed around where every cow, heifer, or anything can utilize those. We do tend to run into some repair issues because you get those cows rubbing on those apparatuses, just itching and just general things like that, especially if you got, you've turned the bulls out. They're rough on all equipment. So just keeping up with those repairs. Back rubbers, very similar. Still making sure they're recharged with the diesel as well as the insecticide. But very similar to those dust bags. We can also do the oral larvicides or the feed-throughs, which are insect growth regulators, where they don't technically kill the adults, but they do stop those larvae from maturing into adult flies. So it's not necessarily going to kill off the adult population, but it will hopefully reduce your numbers later in the season. But that consistent and daily intake is kind of our crucial feed-through method. And when I say timing, just making sure that because it has to actually enter the system after consumption to be able to stop the larva from maturing, we want to see those oral feed-throughs at least 30 days before the fly season is set to begin, and continuing those for 30 days after the fly season. So it's a pretty lengthy period of time. And that's mainly because we're able then to catch those early fly populations and then hopefully catch that late fly population so we aren't having larvae or those eggs overwinter in the manure, and allowing hopefully for the next year also to have a lower fly population. So we're trying to think a little bit more in the future with some of these feed-throughs. Fly tags and injectables are kind of our two others that we can be thinking about, and we'll get into more details on fly tags here in just a second. The ear tags, kind of the timing of control is the big one, is we don't want to apply those fly tags until those fly populations are close or at those economic thresholds that we discussed previously, which we hope to at least make it till after June 1st. But we're hoping to push to at least mid-June because each fly tag has an active period where they're going to be the most effective in controlling fly populations. And we want to make sure that is going to catch the entire, like the large fly population above that economic threshold. Like I discussed with the feed additives, at least 30 days before the flies. And then for the back rubbers and dusters, because they're using that every day and it's making direct contact with those flies, just watching for those economic thresholds. So more in depth a little bit here on fly tags. We have 3 different active ingredient, main active ingredients, I should say. We have pyrethroids, organophosphates, and ivermectins. Each one interacts with those flies in a different way, which we'll get into what those systems include. But if we can, tag as late as possible because, like I said, depending on what tag you select, depends on how long that product will be most effective. So most of them last between 8 and 13 weeks when they're the most effective, and they're most effective in that first, 8 weeks of use. And that can become a problem if we have a prolonged fly year. So then after that threshold where they are active for, we may want to consider, if we're still continuing to have a longer fly season, should we be moving to a different product? And To reduce that resistance that I was talking about with the horn flies, we want to alternate those active ingredients each year. So basically kind of try and put on a 3-year cycle where 1 year you're using a pyrethroid, the next year you're going to use an organophosphate, the third year you're going to use an avermectin. And that's going to allow those products to be more continuously used instead of just using the same active ingredient or type of ingredient each year. Because as you'll notice, probably that first year, maybe 2 years, you'll get really good fly control. And then as those flies become accustomed to that product and become resistant, you're going to get less and less control. And then we're going to have to remove that from our system. We want to tag those mature cows and any weaned calves. Those newborn calves from the year, we aren't really worried about. That cow is going to provide that protection through that tag. I do know there are some producers that do tag those calves as well. And that's to allow also not only for their protection, but also to help those cows get a bigger spread of that insecticide along the belly as well, especially in those really severe populations. Once we're done at the end of the season, remove all those tags because we may still have a little bit of active ingredient left in there and we don't want to cause resistance issues. But once again, as you know, all of our the pesticide labeling and things like that with those types of labels, read your label. How long is it effective for? What's our active ingredient? And what are the directions are kind of our big ones we want to look at. So these are just a few examples. There's several more available out there for use by producers. This is also something to maybe discuss with a veterinarian if you're having some extreme fly issues. Maybe they have some other options or some different combinations that they would suggest. But we have some organophosphate tags on the top, pyrethroid tags in the middle, and then there is a combination tag. And then we have what's called also our macrocyclic lactone, which is that different active ingredient as well. So we can have a different type of active ingredient each year. So these are just some generals that, depends on what you're looking for. But I just want to point out, not the brand itself, but this tag here is the one that fits over their ear tag in general. Sometimes could be convenient. However, I don't know if anybody has tried to fit that ear tag in an old ear tag hole or something in the ear. I imagine this may also be a little bit challenging in trying to get those tags to fit correctly over their ear tag itself. So sounds like a lot of fun. We have those feed additives. So there's the Altacid, which I would say is the most common, Clarifly, and then Rabon. And they are insect growth regulators. They stop the larval growth cycle. They do not kill the adult flies. But once again, reading those labels, because Altacid is only labeled for horn flies, Rabon is labeled for horn face and stable flies, and then Clarifly is stable in horn flies. So depending on the fly species you have will depend on which product you're going to choose. And like I said previously, start 30 days before the flies start, or at least your best estimate. So at least here in Montana, probably for us would be, May 1st to May 15th, and then wait until after that killing frost, which it kind of just depends on the year for us here. Last year, I think we didn't get an actual killing frost in our area in Miles City here in the southeast part of the state until well into October. So we can have a pretty lengthy season depending on where you're at. Now, I was trying to look yesterday because I always get a lot of questions about garlic. Does it work? What is it doing? And at this time, my opinion's still up in the air on this. I did try to look yesterday and see if there was any new research coming out, and I have not really found anything other than this one article from a few years ago up in Canada about they used both garlic oil in a sprayer as well as dehydrated garlic powder in their mineral. And basically, the theory behind garlic is that it's using these sulfur-based compounds to create the strong odor to repel flies. It does not kill the flies; it just repels. So they did some work here. Oh, it's almost 10 years ago now. Looking at a couple different ranches, and then whether they had garlic or not. But the one thing I do always try and point out where yes, it does seem they would reduce the numbers. However, the fly abundance did not reach economic thresholds of those 200 horn flies or more. This was the species they were looking at. And so I'm just not going to make a yay or nay on this of yes, I know a lot of companies have started to put garlic in their product as a potential fly control method. So I'm not saying it doesn't work. But for me, the jury's still out on this, as there's just not been a lot of research done on this topic. And so, but we do see, according to this paper here up from some work up in Saskatchewan, that we did see a reduction in the defensive behaviors, the tail switching, the stomping and things like that, the shivering, and they did see a little that, well, if we look at intake, even though it wasn't significant, apparently the cows didn't care much for the garlic in there. I would have thought it would have made it taste better than the salt block or the mineral that they had. But there has been one published study out there. So just pointing this out that there is some potential there. I think we just need some more work on it. So the big one with why I would keep saying active ingredient is because we need to vary our mode of action each year as well. And that's just the process of how that insecticide is working on the molecular level for those insects. And that's the key to help managing that resistance of those horn flies. So rotate that mode of action. And I also recommend that active ingredient every year. And if you're using 2 applications per season, let's say we have a really prolonged season and we chose our first tag only has 8 weeks of protection. So let's say if we tagged on June 1st, that's going to get us through the end of July. We still have a lot of fly season left after July. So we may need to rotate active or mode of action ingredients within the season as well to make sure we're managing resistance. So there's several modes of actions, and they can impact nerve and muscle, growth, respiration, any sort of midgut. And then there's a couple that are unknown or a non-specific mode of action. And so it's knowing what part of that insect is going to be impacted. And we have a lot for nerve and muscle, quite a few for growth and respiration, but beyond that, we don't have a lot in these other categories. So we do have several, different modes of action we can target. So like, let's say the group 1, which like it was our organophosphates, they're these acetylcholine esterase inhibitors. Group 3 are our pyrethroids and pyrethrins, or as I'm sure some of you recognize, the DDT. Those are sodium channel modulators. The spinosad here is group 5. Avermectins are group 6. And then we have a few others in this 15 or 21 that we can also use and are some part of some of our active ingredients. So altering these modes of action within that active ingredient as well can help us prolong the use of some of these products. So always read the label. Those precautionary statements, especially in a lot of our porons and things. How long is that withdrawal period? What's that active ingredient? Wear your personal protective equipment, gloves, especially dusters and things like that, depending on your sensitivity. May need a dust mask, gloves, goggles, things like that. The withdrawal time, and then how to properly dispose, especially on those dusters and those back rubbers, the oilers and things like that. Where are we going to properly dispose of these products? So if you have if you want more information on what mode of action and classification you're looking at, here's a couple of websites. for that, that'll help you. You can choose different products. And it will walk you through exactly what you're choosing and what active ingredient it is and what that is going to impact on the insects. So general considerations overall, there's always advantages and disadvantages depending on what you're treating and what method you're using. So which flies are on those labels. If we're running into quite a few face fly or stable fly problems, we may have to really look at that label and see if they are labeled for those fly species. How long is that product going to last, and what is that withdrawal time? I know it seems like I'm kind of harping on that withdrawal time a little bit, but I think it's really important as we're in this breeding season, or if we have some dry cows and things like that, maybe they lost their calf and we're looking at sending them to the sales barn or sending them to get harvested. And so I just want everybody to be aware of that. What's it going to cost you? Not necessarily just the product, but also your labor, or the guys that work with you's labor. What is that costing you as well? But also what's going to be simpler too, less stress on you, less stress on the cows and calves. So convenience can also come into play, especially as we move later in the season and maybe those cows aren't as close to home as they might be or as easy to gather up with some working facilities. Working with your neighbors on their fly control methods can really help determine how well that fly season is going to go, especially if you guys are running in common or if you're in pretty close proximity to each other. But when in doubt, always can develop a plan and discuss this with your veterinarian. They're your immune experts, and so they're the ones that are really going to have some of this knowledge on maybe what products should be best used for some of your situations. So I just threw up some 2025 challenges, and I first did some of these slides here back, I think it was like 2022 or something like that, 23. And I realized the challenges never seem to change all that much because flies are always a challenge. I don't know where everybody's at in the program, but grasshoppers here in Montana in certain areas, they're on there. I think they're supposed to be like a 2 or 3 year cycle. I think in most areas here in Montana that have had bad grasshoppers, I think we're on years 5 or 7. And so they're always a challenge. It seems like every year we discuss drought, depending on the year. And I know at least here in Montana and quite a bit of the West, we're discussing drought again and how that's going to impact not only our calf prices this fall, but what sort of methods we're going to use to treat some of these parasites now. What's our grass quality looking like? Because ultimately we're looking at impacts of reproduction rates, weaning weights, and how these are actually going to impact our calves long term, those replacement heifers and things like that. And I think, these last year into probably, I think the last economic forecast I saw, they were expecting these high cattle prices to remain at least into 2026, potentially all year, and maybe even into 2027. I'm not an economist, and I know we all keep hoping for high prices, but that really impacts what we're spending on some of these cattle and making sure we get all our calves to weaning time and getting them sold and things to help us through this smallest cattle herd in the U.S. here and ever. So anyway, that's all I have. And I know Benton said maybe at the end for questions. So I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Megan. Very good information. I think it's very helpful and timely. And as we go into summer, I think there's a lot to think about there and to possibly implement. So just open the floor up here for a few questions if you have any. I think you can type those in the chat. So if you have some questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. I guess I have one question. In terms of the resistance, you mentioned pyrethroids, organophosphates, and also avermectins. So are there some of those that you see that flies are more resistant to today, or maybe there's resistance to all of them, so we've lost our ability to use any of them, or where do we stand kind of in that regard?
I think primarily there is some resistance to all, but I think our primary concern is the pyrethroids because they were used for years over and over. And I know, especially on the poron side, I don't like the product name, but we always use the ivermectin or all things like that for years as our poron, and I think we're really starting to see that resistance to even the lice populations too in the wintertime from those ivermectins that we just because they worked so well at the beginning and continue to use them year after year. But for fly tags, I what I have noticed is and read is the pyrethroids.
Yep, yep. Just checking the chat here. Oh, there is. Oh, you may have to put the questions in. Yeah, the chat might be disabled, so there is a question and answer button at the bottom. So if you have any questions, maybe as opposed to the chat, maybe look to the question and answer button. So if you would like to do that, please look there and maybe put your questions in that section. We got one other question. I was thinking about the cost of the various methods of treating or preventing flies. And I'm sure it depends on the cost of the calves and all of that, but generally speaking, cost of cost of these different treatments or preventions, is that outweighed by production, increased production?
I remembered I was on mute before I was going to speak. I think that's the big question. I had a nice from a few years ago. I had some nice price spreadsheet that I had worked out, like what it cost you per tag to put it in. Um, and so obviously your more expensive tags or your more expensive products are going to reduce the price you're going to get because you may not see that it's not because you spent an extra $5 a calf that you're going to see an extra 20 pounds compared to other products. Um, I think in the end, I mean, for me, I guess I think it will outweigh the cost of that tag just based on not only weaning weight production, perhaps, but also immune system impacts, which are a little bit more difficult to measure. Um, but those calves tend to, I would think, be more healthy throughout the summer, as well as then as they enter the feedlot as we come into the weaning time frame and so I think they are gonna those treatment methods are gonna outweigh uh, the cost or the benefits are gonna outweigh the cost of those products. But I did have that and I meant to look at it and I forgot all and now I put it somewhere and now I'll have to go find it again.
Well, I'm looking at the Q&A button here. You know, Michelle asked that I mention that Q&A button, and we've done that. So we do have a question.
Does grazing management have any impact on fly populations? Yeah, I believe it does. I mean, those oh, it's probably more in the sense of how long or what type of product you're using, but we noticed it specifically more in the stable fly population year, I remember, because we had such a drought for the previous 3 years, and then all of a sudden we had so much rain. Our grass production was huge. Wasn't anything in the grass nutritionally, but just it's always a double-edged sword with everything. But because that ground we there wasn't anything in it. The cattle, honestly, they grazed it, but they didn't get a lot out of it. So it allowed that ground to stay wet, moist longer, which propagated those populations. Plus, I think it's more of manure issue on the grazing side of things. If those cows are in there longer, they don't have any fly control, or we just haven't started any yet. It's allowing more manure to set on that pasture, which means there could potentially be more eggs laid and that larva production. So I think it's more along those terms than maybe like an overgrazing, undergrazing situation. And then if we have any of those water sources where it's nice and shady, we can see some of those increased base fly populations as well. And we try to keep our cows, we don't want those destroyed. So they tend to maybe not graze as much down there.
Well, I'll make a last call here for questions. If you have questions, please look to the question and answer button there at the bottom of your screen and maybe type one in. And if I don't see any others coming up here pretty quick, I think we'll move forward. But I'll give you a chance just to think here for a moment. Okay, seeing no other questions, I just want to thank you, Megan, for being a part of our webinar here this afternoon. If anybody does have questions, maybe for Megan, remember she's at Montana State University, and you could find her contact information there. She had it on her last slide. Maybe you jotted that down. If you ever need help trying to get in touch with her, you could contact one of the officers here at the Northwest chapter of the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists, and we'd be happy to try and connect you that way as well. So with that, Megan, again, thank you very much for the timely information about flies and maybe how to control them, and really appreciate your time here this afternoon.
Thanks, Benton. And if anybody wants a copy of the slides, I'd be happy to forward those on to you if anybody would like those.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so we're going to move on to our next presentation here this afternoon. Dr. Jeffery Hall is a cattle technical service veterinarian for Huvepharma. He was a professor at Utah State University in the Animal, Dairy, and Veterinary Sciences Department, and he held an appointment in the Utah Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory as the head of diagnostic toxicology for about 25 years. He has a BS in agriculture from Oklahoma State University, and that's where he received his DVM. Let me see here. He's a licensed veterinarian and board certified in veterinary toxicology. His past research interest has included natural toxins, nutrition, immunology, virology, parasite control, and mineral toxicology and deficiency. In his role as the toxicologist there at Utah's Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, he investigated various poisoning cases, as well as analyzing thousands of forage, diet, tissue, and bodily fluid samples for their mineral content to try and delineate deficiencies as well as poisonings. So this afternoon, we've asked him to speak a little bit about some mineral and vitamin deficiencies and such as that. And so the title of his presentation is Beef Cattle Vitamin Mineral Deficiencies of the Western United States, Frequency of Occurrence, Effects, Testing, and Potential Losses to Producers. And so with that, I'll turn the time over to Dr. Hall and look forward to your presentation on these various aspects of vitamins and minerals.
Okay, I am going to share my screen. And can you see the slides?
You can see the slides. And yeah, and now you're in slides, sir. Yes, sir.
We will get started then. Thank you very much for the invitation. I enjoyed doing talks for producer groups, for nutritionist groups, and veterinary groups on the vitamin and mineral issue. Even though I work for a company now that's not in that realm, they still give me the freedom to help producers and help veterinarians and nutritionists with these types of issues on a routine basis. So beef vitamin and mineral deficiencies, the most common that we see in the western part of the United States is copper deficiency. Over 67% of the liver samples that I tested at the veterinary diagnostic lab had deficient liver coppers. The second most common was selenium deficiency, with over 62% of the liver samples I tested were deficient in selenium content. And I'll talk about what these deficiencies mean as we get a little bit later. Now, there are certain areas of the western United States, especially along the front range of the Rockies, where you do see selenium excesses occasionally. Do have some areas, and I'll talk about those specific geographic areas a little bit later. Vitamin A and vitamin E deficiencies, we're seeing more commonly in cow-calf operations in the U.S. than we did 30 years ago, and part of that's because of the way we manage our cattle. And I'll talk about those specifics when I talk about the vitamin A and vitamin E specifically. Rare, I see low liver manganese in less than 1% of the beef cattle that I test. Zinc deficiency varies. Most years it'll run 2-3% of the liver samples that I test I would classify as zinc deficient. There are certain years that I will see a higher incidence of zinc deficiency in certain geographic areas. And when I've looked at that over close to 30 years of working with vitamins and minerals, I find that the higher percentage of animals that I find to be zinc deficient are typically directly associated with a severe drought year or for a year or two after the break of a major multi-year drought. There's not a lot of real good research to prove why this happens, but we do know that during severe drought, there's good research with selenium, good research with sulfur that indicates that during really severe drought, as you get air deeper and deeper into the soil matrix, you can convert elemental sulfur or elemental selenium to selenate or sulfate, the oxidized form, which is the chemical form that plants can take up. The reverse likely occurs with some of the true metals, to where ionized zinc, which is the form that plants can take up, gets converted to zinc oxide. And then it takes a period of time after you reestablish moisture deep in the soil matrix for the microbes to convert that zinc oxide, which plants can't take up, back to ionizable zinc, which the plants can take up. And then the last one is cobalt. I get a lot of questions about cobalt deficiency. I saw cobalt deficiency in less than 0.1% of the liver samples that I tested. While I was there at the diagnostic lab, I was up to running over 6,000 liver samples a year through that small state veterinary diagnostic lab. And so I had a pretty extensive database. In a vast majority of the ones where I truly did see low cobalt to the point where I would classify it as deficient, most of those were very young calves, and that's probably an indication that they may not have got colostrum. Cobalamin, a B vitamin, calves get a fairly substantial amount of that in early colostrum milk. And so a low cobalt in a young calf is probably more an indication that that calf didn't get colostrum than a true cobalt deficiency. So I got a question, it's probably close to 25 years ago now at a producer meeting. Very, very legitimate question. An older producer asked me, why do we see all these deficiencies now when we didn't see them 30 years ago? And so if you think of a time frame 50 years ago, that's about the time frame he would have been comparing to the time that I was doing the meeting he was at. And my first response is, they've always been there. You're not going to see them if you don't test for them. And so the obvious answer is, we're doing more testing now, so we see it more commonly now, but it's always been there. Other times where we see more deficiencies, in 2008 to 2011, I saw almost a doubling of the deficiencies in certain geographic areas compared to normal years due to cost cutting. Economics got bad. Cattle prices weren't great. Fuel prices tripled. Hay prices doubled. Everybody was looking ways to cut costs. And what I see routinely in the cattle industry is when economic times get tough, one of the first things to go is a really good mineral program because they can get something cheaper and still be given a mineral. But as the old saying goes, you get what you pay for. More common testing. We've also increased production output. If you think of a time period 50 years ago, on a commercial operation, how many people were preg checking their cows? It was a very small percentage. And so on average, when you look at the USDA data from 50 years ago, you can actually mathematically calculate that once a cow reached sexual maturity, they were producing 2 calves every 3 years. So a cow was given a year off to build her system up. We don't let a cow do that today. You know, a higher percentage of commercial cattle operations are preg checking their cows every year now. Cow's not pregnant, you know, she goes to town, she's next week's Happy Meal. And so we're expecting a cow to produce a calf every year instead of 2 calves out of every 3, giving her the same groceries to do it on. And so when you're pushing cattle to have higher production, you're going to see deficiencies more commonly just because of the higher push on the animals. We've also altered nature, and this becomes a critical point when we start talking about the vitamin A and vitamin E. You know, we've altered calving dates. I look back at my grandfather. He calved everything out in May and June. My dad on the same operation calved everything out in March. And my older brother on the same operation today is calving everything out in February. I tell people to look at nature. You know, when do the wild ruminants typically have their offspring? And it's a little bit of a trick question because in South Texas, they'll have them about a month to month and a half earlier than they have them up in northern Montana. But it's generally 30 to 60 days after spring green up. And when are we asking most of our spring producing cows to have their babies? 30 to 60 days before anything has a chance of turning green. From a true nutrition standpoint, the worst possible time of the year to be dropping a calf unless you're supplementing the animal appropriately to account for that differences. And I also see more mineral deficiencies in drought areas, and I'll talk about why that occurs a little bit later. So with that in mind, you know, the most common deficiencies we see are going to be copper, selenium, and zinc. Oddly enough, these 3 elements are very critical in many similar systems in the body. And so we see a lot of similarities in clinical effects from these deficiencies. You know, the biggest financial loss from these deficiencies occurs in the calf crop. You know, cows will also have deficiencies. Cows can also have effects, but the biggest financial loss to an individual cow-calf operation is associated with the effects in the calves. So what does a deficiency in the calf cause? It's going to cause poorer growth rate. And early in my career, I was at a meeting and a couple of nutritionists cornered me and said, even really low mineral content in the diet is enough to feed the bugs. I agree with that 100%. But the mineral that affects the animal not only has to feed the bugs in the rumen, but has to feed the animal systemically. And where we see the biggest effects on decreased growth rate is because of that systemic effect. You're going to see poorer immune system function. This poorer immune system function allows the animal to be more susceptible to disease. Anybody that knows anything about disease knows that one of the first things an animal does when it becomes sick, and it doesn't matter whether it's a dog, cat, horse, rabbit, cow, or a human, is they lose appetite. As they decrease feed intake and they're using a lot of energy to fight off disease, those animals are not going to gain as well. And so much of that poorer growth rate is just due to the fact that we see more disease, even though it may be what's classified as subclinical disease. The calves aren't sick enough that you have to treat them, but they're still sick enough they're not eating well. So you're going to see increased susceptibility to various diseases like diarrheas, pneumonias, pink eyes, foot rots. I mean, any place where you have a potential organism that can cause a disease, if the immune system's not working appropriately, you're going to see more disease. With selenium deficiency, you'll also see white muscle disease. Selenium is very critical in some of the antioxidant enzyme systems in the body. And so the highest metabolic rate tissues in the body are typically muscle tissue. And so those tissues are going to be more affected when you lose those selenium-containing enzymes that provide that redox protection. And so you can see white muscle disease in skeletal muscle. You can see it in heart muscle. Hoof problems, you're going to see more foot rots when you have zinc deficiencies. Zinc is a very critical element for the integument system as well. And so you can see skin, hair, and hoof issues when you have zinc deficiencies. Calves have to be born with higher body reserves than an adult. And I've found over time when I explain it this way, it becomes very easy to understand. In the first 90 days of a calf life, close to 95% of that calf's diet is milk. And if you think about it, how much copper is there in milk? How much selenium is there in milk? How much zinc is there in milk? It's not zero, but it's close to it. So from a true dietary need, that first 90 days of life, when the vast majority of that calf's diet is milk, it's on a deficient diet. And so it has to be born with extra reserves in its liver to get it through that early growth period, because in that first 90 days of life, it should also triple its birth weight in a high production calf. And so just if it's not getting much of anything in the diet, just by dilution alone, if it triples its body size, if it's not born with higher liver reserves, it will be deficient. A cow will actually deplete her own system, moving mineral to the fetus to try to make sure that calf is born with enough reserves. And just to give you an example, normal copper in the liver of cattle on a wet weight basis should be between 25 and 100 part per million. In a very young calf, say a 2-3 day old calf, if that calf has less than 65 to 70 part per million copper in its liver, it has deficient reserves because it doesn't have enough to get it through that early growth period when it's getting very little in the diet. So a deficiency in a calf is caused by a maternal deficiency because mother should have moved enough into that fetus to where it had enough liver reserves to get it through that early growth period. A deficient maternal deficiencies are often due to inadequate intake. If people actually look at forage contents of most of the minerals, if you look at copper, for example, NRC recommends a minimum of 10 part per million total dietary. Most of our Western forages contain between 2 and 6 part per million copper. That means even if they're on the best grass in the county, they're getting half or less of what they need on a daily basis. And that's if you don't have any interferences. We also deal with a lot of interferences in the western part of the U.S. High sulfur in the forages or water, high iron in the forages or water. Excess selenium can interfere with copper and zinc. High molybdenum can directly interfere with copper. And so they're not getting enough in the natural diet. And then if you have any of these additional deficiencies, that's one of the reasons copper deficiency is the most common deficiency that we see, because all these different factors can directly impact copper, and they're not getting enough copper in the diet naturally. Now, maternal deficiencies, what do we see health-wise in our adult animals? Zinc deficiency, copper deficiency, selenium deficiency, all of them also affect reproductive integrity. And so a maternal deficiency can be associated with repeat breeders, poor conception rates, prolonged calving dates, or even non-breeders, open cows at preg check. Poor immune system function. And this comes into play when you're expecting that cow to respond to antigens from vaccines and from natural exposures to provide high antibody load to those organisms in the colostral milk to help protect that calf early in its life when its immune system is still developing. With zinc deficiencies, we can see more lamenesses, more foot rots. With selenium deficiencies in adult animals, you can see sudden death from heart failures. I've had a number of registered Angus breeders that have told me there's no reason for me to test. I cannot have a copper deficiency. My cows are nice, shiny, and black. I said earlier, normal copper should be between 25 and 100 part per million. I classify an animal as deficient when it's less than 20 because I see poor production parameters, more open cows, smaller weaning weights, etc., at less than 20. But you're typically not going to get the hair coat color change till you're less than 7 to 10. And so they pass deficiency quite a while before you ever see that hair coat color change. Sample of choice for testing is liver. This is especially true with copper. Serum is a very poor indicator of copper status. And I'll use an example out of Colorado to emphasize this point. I had a veterinarian submit 10 liver biopsy samples and 10 serum samples from the same 10 cows. I called him and told him there was no reason to run both. Liver's going to give you your best information. And he said, no, he had to run both to prove a point to a client. The highest liver copper that we got was 10. 9 of the 10 samples were less than 8. One of the samples had 2 parts per million copper. On those same 10 serum samples, only one of the 10 animals had a low serum value. Because ceruloplasmin, the binding protein for copper in serum, has such a strong affinity for copper, serum values typically don't drop until you have a severe systemic deficiency. And so serum is a poor indicator. With selenium, serum, whole blood, liver, all give you a good indication, but serum gives you a better indication of more recent intake. Whole blood gives you kind of a weighted average as that selenium is incorporated into the red cells when they're being produced. And liver gives you an indication of storage. So with copper, for example, if you have a deficient serum, it's accurate. But if you have a normal value in serum, it's still questionable, and that can be true for zinc as well. Copper excess, not typically a problem in beef-producing cattle. I see copper excess oversupplementation in dairy cattle routinely. Excess copper can interfere with iron, selenium, and zinc, and it can also cause mild to severe functional liver changes. The reason I put this in here when I'm talking predominantly about beef cattle is because I am seeing occasional excess coppers in some beef dairy cross calves that are coming into feedlots, where they're being oversupplemented in milk replacer, oversupplemented in starter rations, and then oftentimes feedlots will give them excess supplementation early on in the feeding period because they're used to getting beef calves in that are deficient. And I've actually seen some dairy beef cross calves come into some of these feedlots that have actually died from copper poisoning just due to excessive supplementation at several phases of their life cycle. Selenium excess, seleniferous areas, which means there's high amounts of selenium in the soil, are fairly common in northeastern Colorado, the very eastern edge of Wyoming, the eastern edge of Montana, northwestern area of Nebraska, most of North Dakota, and about the western half to 2/3 of South Dakota. Interestingly enough, selenium poisoning affects the exact same organ systems that selenium deficiency affects. And so you're going to have impairment of the immune system. You can actually see white muscle disease from selenium poisoning and from selenium deficiency. You can see poor reproductive performance with selenium excess. Excess selenium in forages or waters, either one, can also directly interfere with the intestinal absorption of copper and zinc. And so excess selenium can have major impacts in seleniferous area that requires very tightly managed supplementation plans. Chemical forms of minerals can make a big difference. This is a study that I did looking at sodium selenite, one of the most common forms of selenium supplementation in cattle supplement plans, and then selenomethionine, an organic form of selenium that's also used in supplementation plans. And at each dose, now granted, these were at high doses because this was a toxicity study, but also I used the 3 highest doses on the graph to emphasize the points that I'm wanting to make, but the lower amounts had almost identical differences. The selenite, if you look at the up and down part of the early part of the curve, that gives you an indication of speed of absorption. The peak height and area under the curve give you an indication of overall bioavailability and absorption. And then the terminal elimination, as it stays higher for longer, that gives you a better indication of how well it's retained in the body. And so if you'll notice at each dose, 1, 2, and 3 for selenite and selenomethionine, the selenomethionine was absorbed faster, to about 170% compared to the exact same dose of selenite and retained in the body system longer. So why is that not the one that we use most commonly in our cattle herds that are deficient where we need supplementation? All comes back to cost. Selenomethionine slightly more expensive. But interestingly enough, I told you early on, a lot of times I like to look at nature. How does nature deal with it? The natural chemical form of selenium in grasses is about 93% selenomethionine. So our cattle evolved to use that chemical form of selenium the most efficiently. So they absorb it better and retain it better. Vitamin E deficiency. Vitamin E is a natural antioxidant, fat-soluble vitamin. Because it interacts with redox reactive proteins in the body, and so does the selenium redox reactive proteins in the body, protective proteins. Vitamin E deficiency and selenium deficiency look identical. You cannot tell them apart without doing chemical analysis to determine which one they're deficient in. So deficiencies in calves are going to cause poorer growth rates, weaker calves, poor immune system function, white muscle disease, increased incidence of disease, and you can see sudden deaths from heart failure due to white muscle disease in the heart. Now, vitamin A is also a fat-soluble vitamin that has some redox reactive capacity, but it's also very critical in a number of other areas in the body. Vitamin A is essential for normal cell division. And so highly rapidly dividing cells like the cells in the GI tract are going to be more severely affected with vitamin A deficiency than other cells in the body. Now, it's also important in the immune system function. And so deficient calves, you're going to have poor growth rates, weak calves, poor immune system function, but you're also going to have poor digestive tract integrity because vitamin A is critical in cell division, and cells that line the gut are the fastest dividing cells in the body. You're going to have an effect on cell division in the gut. Vitamin A is also critical for the connective junctions between the enterocytes, the cells that line the gut. And so as you start losing those tight connective junction between the cells, you start losing barrier capacity for opportunistic organisms. Because you're not only dividing the cells slower, but they don't have as tight junctions between the cells, you're going to see a high susceptibility to diarrheas from opportunistic organisms. And these animals don't respond well to therapy, so you're going to see a high incidence of death loss in these calves. So why do we see vitamin A and vitamin E deficiency? They're both fat-soluble vitamins that require either the intake of green vegetation or supplements. Once vegetations turn brown and senesce, there's no vitamin A or vitamin E left in them. And so a cow will retain, because they're fat-soluble, a several month supply of vitamin A and vitamin E in her body fats, as long as she has adequate intake during growing seasons. The big reason that we see more vitamin A and vitamin E deficiencies now than we've ever seen before is because of the way we manage our cattle today compared to 20 and 30 years ago. We see a lot of vitamin A and vitamin E deficiencies in drought areas, but it's not actually during the drought. It's in the spring calving season after a drought the summer before. So during severe drought, you have a shorter growing season the summer before. The cows are eating green vegetation for a shorter period of time. They build up less body fat reserves. And unlike the minerals where the calves are born with high excesses in the liver, these calves are born with lower values in the liver, and they should get a really large amount of vitamin A and vitamin E in that early colostral milk that's already bound to the active carrier proteins where it's 100% effective upon ingestion. But if a cow goes several months after the last time she's had anything green and not getting any adequate supplementation, her body fats are going to run out. She's not going to be able to put that truckload of vitamin A and vitamin E in that early colostral milk. And then we'll see calves that don't get it. And we'll oftentimes start to see those calves break with diarrheas at 3 to 5 days of age with just severe, almost impossible, very difficult to control diarrheas in those calves that are vitamin A deficient. Liver serum, both are adequate for testing. Vitamin A and vitamin E analysis are quite expensive. if you understand the environmental conditions that predispose to having these vitamin A and vitamin E deficiencies, planning supplementation strategies to correct it is a lot more cost effective and beneficial than spending a lot of money on testing after the fact. Manganese deficiency, there again, beef cattle, it's not common. It's rare in beef cattle. It's necessary. Manganese is necessary for normal bone and joint development as well as reproductive function. And in scientifically induced dietary deficiencies, they were able to show an associated with increased incidence of cystic ovaries, repeat breeders, and weak calves. There again, chemical form can make a difference. This was a university's high production dairy herd. Each of those lines represents 15 high production dairy cows. This is manganese concentration in whole blood. Normal should be above 0.02. So all 45 of the cows prior to the study had subnormal values. We had a third of the animals that were maintained on their normal diet. A third of the animals had the inorganic manganese, 50% of it removed and replaced with an organic form. And the last third, 100% of the inorganic manganese was removed and replaced with an organic form. And so even within 4 weeks, the group getting the organic chemical form of manganese had normal values compared to the animals that were getting 100% inorganic. So chemical form of mineral supplementations can make a major difference on bioavailability and how well animals can absorb it and use it. Overall effects on immunity. Copper, selenium, zinc, vitamin A, vitamin E, and to a degree manganese, they're all required for normal immunity. So when we see a deficiency, we're going to see a direct immune compromise. The immune cells are not going to function at optimum capacity. But we're also going to see an indirect immune compromise. I mean, most ranchers revaccinate their cows every year. Yes, a little bit of that revaccination is to protect the adult animal, but the biggest majority of it is to boost the immune system to where you have more antibodies circulating in that adult animal that can then be put in the colostrum to protect the next generation. So with these deficiencies, you're going to see poorer response to vaccines. And if you have poorer response to vaccines, you're going to see poorer colostral qualities. To emphasize this point, I'll go back to a research project done out of the University of Missouri that they actually helped me evaluate after the study was done. Now, granted, I would not have wished this project on my worst enemy. The poor graduate student that was doing this project, I believe they were working with 75 range cows. A third of them were on what I considered a suboptimal mineral supplementation plan. A third of them were on a low-level organic mineral supplementation plan, and a third of them were on a really good high-quality organic mineral supplementation plan. When these cows calved, the grad student had to hand milk every single one of these range cows because they were quantifying total milk produced and total antibody load in that colostral milk. The amount of busted knuckles must have been amazing. What they found was the cattle on the real high quality mineral supplementation plan actually had 10% more milk produced than the cows on the poor quality plan. And the antibody load was over double. And so optimum supplementation with these key trace elements that are necessary for normal immune system function can have major impacts on not only the animal ingesting it, but also on subsequent generations, the calves born to these cows that are being supplemented. I also caution people about vaccine site reactions. I mean, anybody that's worked with cattle, they'll occasionally get a group of cattle in, they'll work them, and they'll end up with these fluid-filled nodules on the side of their neck where they vaccinated them. Now, I'm not talking the pus pockets. That's dirty needles. I'm talking these fluid-filled pockets that in a week to 10 days go away. There is not real good research on the ruminant side, but there is great research on the swine side and on the small animal side showing that when you have copper deficiency or zinc deficiency and the systemic immune system is compromised, that the body tries to ramp up the local immune system. So you'll actually start to see increased numbers of mast cells in the subcutaneous tissues. You're injecting that animal with an antigen, the vaccine. You have the potential of stimulating mast cell degranulation, which gives you a swelling response. I tell people, think about it like a bee sting or a wasp sting. That swelling response you get from a bee sting or wasp sting is due to mast cell degranulation. Now just ramp that up on a big scale, and animals that have systemic immune compromise that may have an increased subcutaneous mast cells and you're sticking an antigen in them, they may get a swelling response. I find that when I get big groups of animals that have these swelling responses, especially the severe swelling responses, if you look close enough, you will typically find either a zinc deficiency or copper deficiency. Timing of supplementation, vaccine timing. One thing that I think a lot of people do wrong in the Intermountain West is, especially cattle that go up on high mountain range, is they've been up on the mountain oftentimes with no mineral supplementation plan for several months. They pull them down, and the first thing they do when they run them off the truck is run them through a chute, vaccinate everything, and wean everything. Are you really getting the bang for your buck for your vaccine if those animals are in poor mineral status coming off the mountain? I tell people, and I've got ranches that do it, when you pull them down, give them 30 days on a really good high quality supplementation plan, then run them through the chute and vaccinate them, and you'll get a lot better bang for your buck with your vaccines. So it's not wise to vaccinate an animal that's in poor condition for vitamin mineral balance because you're not going to get an optimum response. You want to optimize calf health. The vast majority of the mineral that's moved from mother to fetus occurs in the last trimester of gestation. So that last 3 months of gestation is critical that mama's getting enough to where she has enough to move those extra reserves into that fetus to where the calf's born with enough. Well, then you also have cows that have just pushed their system, depleted a lot out of their system to make sure the calf was born with enough. That 3-month window between calving and breed back, you got to make sure mama's getting supplemented adequately to build her system back up to where she starts cycling and breeding at an efficient time period. Testing forage and diets. I often caution people, the mineral content can vary during growth seasons. It can vary year to year. And you also have to remember water is an important component of the diet. So if you're testing only the forages and not the waters, you're not seeing the whole picture of dietary intake and potential interferences. If you test the animal, they've already ingested the forages, the supplements, and the waters. You're still going to see some variability. It may be due to age of the animal. I do see a slightly higher incidence of deficiencies in younger cows, especially replacement heifer and first calvers, than I do in more aged cows. It can vary based on time of the year. You know, if you're giving them a really good high quality supplement during calving season, and yet you're having breeding issues in July, testing them in April is probably not going to give you the answer that you're looking for on whether that's the reason you're having poor reproductive performance. Herd testing. There again, a lot of people want to test serums. You need to test groups of animals. 5 to 10 similarly fed and treated animals within a group, depending upon the group size. You have to remember copper is always questionable. It's the most common deficiency we see, so you have to take serum with a grain of salt when you're doing analysis. Also, if you have hemolysis in the serum sample that you collect, and a lot of serum samples will have hemolysis, there is 3 to 5 times as much zinc inside a red blood cell as there is in a clean serum. There's about 1.5 times as much selenium inside a red cell as there is in a clean serum. There's about 50 times as much iron inside a red cell as there is in a clean serum. So any degree of hemolysis can potentially mask true deficiencies. Liver samples, I tell people save samples from normal animals. What does that mean? Well, you don't want to test the animal that's been sick in the lot, not eating well for the last 3 to 4 weeks, has been treated with everything under the sun, and then died anyway. I mean, you have a sick animal that dies in 24, 48 hours, testing the liver from that animal, you're going to have some mobilization of trace minerals, but it's not going to be enough to have a significant impact on the liver values in that short time period. Or I'm a big proponent of doing liver biopsies on healthy animals and within a herd to get an idea of where your herd status is. This is just an example of a calf that I was doing a meeting up in Montana. I was writing my reports up at about 1 o'clock in the morning after I gave a set of lectures during the day. And this was a calf that had came into the diagnostic lab. It was a calf that came in early July. It was a 4-month-old calf. A calf should reach adult normal values by about 4 to 5 months of age for copper and selenium. Interestingly enough, manganese is opposite of the other minerals. Calves are born with lower values than an adult, and they don't get up to adult normal ranges till 5 to 6 months of age. So with copper in a 4-month-old calf, I would consider anything less than 20 to be deficient. This calf was 13.6. Selenium, normal is 0.25 to 0.5. I consider anything less than 0.2 to be deficient. So this calf was copper and selenium deficient both. Now manganese, normal in an adult is 2 to 6. Normal in an early neonate is 0.9 to 4.5. So in a 4-month-old calf, 1.8 is slightly below the adult normal range. But for a 4-month-old calf, I would still consider that at the low end of the normal range for that age of a calf. Now, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story is the reason this calf came into the diagnostic lab to start with is because it died of summer pneumonia. I see a really high incidence of summer pneumonia calves that have mineral deficiencies. And you will see some herds where they'll have summer pneumonias at, a month and a half, 2 months of age. You'll have some herds where they don't see summer pneumonias in anything until they get out to about 4 or 5 months of age. Part of that differences in age of the calf between herds can be explained based on how much body reserves did that calf get born with. If it got born close to normal body reserves, it's going to take it longer to become deficient than if it was born significantly below those body reserves that it needed at birth. Those calves will become deficient much quicker just due to growth. So drought effects. Vitamin A and vitamin E, I've already talked about why we see an effect from drought on vitamin A and vitamin E, but we also see drought effects on minerals. Now, most loose free choice vitamin mineral supplementation plan intake is limited by the amount of phosphorus and salt content. As you increase salt or increase phosphorus, you will gradually decrease the amount of intake. Intake is also based on relative percentage of total dietary intake. So during drought conditions where cows have less overall forage to eat, they're going to get less minerals out of their natural diet because there's less groceries for them to eat overall. But oftentimes you see a drop in the mineral intake at the same time because it's eaten at a proportional rate. I tell ranchers, watch the mineral intake on your cattle. I mean, if you're feeding a mineral that's to be eaten at 4 ounces per head per day, a 50-pound bag of mineral will feed 200 cows one day. Okay, know the number of cows you have, know the amount of mineral they're eating, keep track on a weekly basis on what their intake is. As was mentioned earlier, this can become an issue even with feed through fly control products. If they're not eating enough of the product, they may not be getting adequate effect. Mineral intake needs to be monitored. I tell the same thing to salespeople for companies that sell minerals. You have a pretty good rough idea of individual producers' cow numbers. Go back and look, how much mineral did they buy the year before? Take that tonnage times 2,000 times 16. That's the number of ounces they used. Divide that really big number by 365 and by the number of cows he owns, and that gives you a rough estimate of number of ounces per head per day. I've had some ranchers tell me that, well, my product says that they're supposed to be eating 4 ounces per head per day, and I pull them off the mountain and they eat close to a pound. Well, that 4 ounces per head per day is if they're eating it 365 days a year. If they're not, you have to give them a little bit of time to build their system back up before they should back down on their intake. So how do I deal with abnormal findings? You know, first question I always ask when I look at a set of data is, are minerals being used just year round? And if they're not, how does their use correlate with when samples were taken on the animals? What is the true mineral intake? And you have to look at all the different mineral forms. There's some people that feed tubs part of the year, feed liquid part of the year, feed loose mineral part of the year, but what is the true mineral intake? Look at the concentrations in the minerals and the chemical form. I can put together a mineral that has really big numbers, but if I put 100% of it as the oxides, which are poorly bioavailable, it's not going to give me the same effect as if I use a value with much lower numbers that has a high percentage of organic mineral in it. So concentration and chemical form are both important to look at. And then have the tags evaluated. I actually had a tag sent to me last week that, according to the label, was supposed to be fed at 4 ounces per head per day, and it was 65% salt. And I'm like, that's not even possible. And so have the tags evaluated. Remember, concentration, chemical form, true intakes, and interferences all interplay in whether a supplementation plan is getting the job done or not. So then we bring it back to, okay, what does it mean? And from a rancher's perspective, the only thing they think about is how much money they're spending on minerals. Turn the table on that. What is the economic loss associated with not doing it correctly? I break it down into reproduction, neonatal health, juvenile health, and weaning weights. And if you look at reproductive function, mild deficiencies, you're going to see 2 to 4% increase in the number of open cows. Me personally, my goal is I want to see 95% breed back in the first 45 days of bull exposure. And I have a lot of guys tell me that's being very optimistic, but I've got a lot of ranches that do it year in, year out. With severe deficiencies, you may see 5 to 15% more open cows. These extra open cows cost money. And the vast majority of the money is because younger cows typically have a higher sensitivity to the deficiencies than mature cows do. And if you think about it this way, a mature cow has what she needs on a daily basis, what she's moving to the fetus, but a young cow has those same 2 demands, but she's still growing. So a younger cow has a slightly higher metabolic demand for trace minerals than a mature cow does. And so oftentimes when you get into marginal deficiencies, if you start looking at the age of the cows, a higher percentage of your extra opens are going to be your younger cows, not your more mature cows. Those younger cows haven't paid for themselves yet. As a general rule, a cow pays for herself when you wean and sell her 4th calf. At today's cattle prices, it's getting close to being her 3rd calf. But those younger open cows that you're having to cull from the herd are costing the ranch money. And at today's cattle prices, selling a first calver because she's open at preg check, you're effectively losing the ranch about $750 in total ranch profits on that cow during her lifetime. After a 2nd calf, you're still losing about $250. After a 3rd calf, at today's prices, you're still losing about $50. Most years, you're still losing about $100 on that cow. Neonatal health. You're going to decrease the number of sick calves. Sick calves cost money in a number of ways because you have to spend money on medicine costs, labor costs, veterinary costs, and you're not going to save every calf that gets sick. You're going to have some death losses there. When you start adding up those financial losses, it becomes significant. With a mild deficiency, you may see an extra 5 to 7% increase in sicknesses in the neonatal health. More diarrheas, more respiratory cases. With severe deficiencies, I've had herds that routinely treat 20-25% of their calf crop every year due to diarrheas and pneumonias. Juvenile health. There again, you're going to decrease summer pneumonia cases. Once I started talking to ranchers about the summer pneumonia cases and the ages of the calves that they were getting summer pneumonias, We corrected mineral supplementation plans. Several of those ranchers literally come back to me and said, we just don't see summer pneumonia cases now. You improve the animal's overall immune system function, they can fight off a lot of things on their own that they can't when their immune system is compromised. You're going to decrease weaning health issues. You're going to decrease death losses and medicine costs, labor costs, veterinary costs. You're also going to improve vaccine efficacy, and so you're going to see better overall immune system function if you retain ownership in those cattle going into backgrounder or feedlot situations. The biggest thing that producers tell me when we identify a mineral deficiency, get it corrected, the one thing that producers see automatically, sometimes they don't see these other losses because it's not giving them a direct income stream immediately. The weaning weight differences give you an immediate financial impact. When you correct a mild deficiency, it's not uncommon to see 20 to 35 pounds increase in your weaning weights across the herd average. You know, at 20 pounds today, that's an extra $60 per calf. With major deficiencies, 50 or more pounds per calf. I had one operation that was culling close to 15% of its cows per year because they were open at preg check. They were also treating close to 15 to 16% of their calves per year for neonatal health issues, another 15 to 20% of their calves for juvenile health issues. When I first got them on a better supplementation plan, the ranch owner called me and cussed me up one side and down the other, said his cows were eating the mineral supplement like it was cotton candy and it was going to make him broke. That fall, I heard from him late in the fall and he called to apologize to me. His weaning weights went up by over 100 pounds per calf. Now, this was a really, really severe deficiency. But he also, instead of culling 15 to 20% of his cows because they were open at preg check, only culled 6% that year. It can make a big difference. I had another producer that was already feeding cows, oftentimes with minor deficiencies. They're already being supplemented, they're just not being supplemented adequately. With severe deficiencies, oftentimes those cows are probably not getting much more than a white salt block, maybe a red salt block for Christmas. But with minor deficiencies, if they're giving them a suboptimal mineral plan, I had one producer that was the case. When he made the correction, it cost him an extra $15 per cow-calf pair to go from a suboptimum plan to a really good mineral supplementation plan that had 35% organic mineral in it. His weaning weights went up by 78 pounds per calf. He said without figuring health, reproduction, or anything else, that gave him $120 per cow increased profit because he had more live calves at the end of the year to sell and they were bigger. And that was several years ago when cattle prices were low. At today's cattle prices, with minor deficiencies, at today's cattle prices, you're looking at about $125 to $130 per cow in lost revenue. With severe deficiencies, at today's cattle prices, you're looking at over $250 per cow in lost revenue. So it's not a small issue. With minor deficiencies, you may spend an extra $15, $18 per cow to go from a suboptimal plan to a good plan, but if you get a $100 return on that, that's giving you about a 7 to 8 to 1 return on investment. With severe deficiencies, you may spend, if you're not giving them much of anything, you may spend $40 to $45 per cow-calf pair. That's still giving you over a 5 to 6 to 1 return on investment. Any banker or economist in the country will tell you that's one of the best investments you can ever get into. And with that, I would open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hall. We do have some time for some questions, so if you have any for Dr. Hall, you can look there at the bottom of your screen and type in a question in the Q&A portion of the screen there. So any questions? So So I have one maybe to start. So when we look at mineral or vitamin supplementation recommendations, that's kind of on the average across a group of cattle or a bunch of animals. So how much variation is there between animals in those kind of recommendations and things? And when we're feeding toward the average, do we ever are we ever pushing those some animals up towards toxicities or not getting them to the level that there may be deficiencies?
You can see variability. That's one of the reasons when I suggest people go into a herd and do liver biopsies. Even with fairly large herds, I want to see 10 to 12 animals. And I want half those animals to be younger animals, half those animals to be mature animals, so I can see some of that variability. I actually had one herd in Montana that they sent me 10 liver biopsies. I called the veterinarian and I was like, you've got to go back and get me some more history on this because something's out of whack. I said, did they purchase some animals? Were they on different supplement plans? He called me back and he said, everything, 1,200 head of mama cows. They sent me 10 biopsies. I had 2 cows that had higher than normal copper and selenium both, not high enough to be toxic, but excessive. 3 at the top end of normal, 3 at the bottom end of normal, and 2 animals were deficient, and they were supposedly all getting the same diet.
Yeah.
So my next question to him was, I said, now you need to go out and find out how many mineral stations they had out for the 1,200 head of cows. He said, why? And I said, I think you've got a pecking order problem. Because no boss cow will stand in a mineral tub and eat more than she really needs, just keep everybody else away. So you have to have enough stations and they have to be spread out far enough to where you don't have a pecking order issue. Turned out they had 1 mineral station for every 125 head. They went back and checked. The 2 cows that had excesses were big boss cows. The 3 cows at the top end of normal were 6 and 7-year-old mature cows. 2 of the animals that were at the bottom end of normal were first calvers, and one of them was a 14-year-old smoothmouther. She'd lost her pecking order status. And the 2 animals that were deficient, one of them was a replacement heifer and one of them was a first calver. Just exactly what you'd expect to see from a pecking order status. When I start seeing too much variability within a herd, I start looking for reasons. Yes, you're always going to have some variability. But when I start seeing too much variability, there's generally another issue involved.
Yeah. Yeah. Appreciate that. There is a question in the Q&A section. I think you're able to see that, correct?
Yes. Okay. What is my experience with deficiencies in beef cattle of some of the major minerals such as phosphorus and magnesium? Phosphorus deficiency is real. Most supplementation plans have adequate phosphorus, and in fact, some cases there's slightly more phosphorus there than is really needed. I'm not a big proponent of 15% phosphorus mineral plans, and I've seen a few of those around the country. That much phosphorus is very expensive, and all you're doing is backing the cattle off of the intake. Typically, in the Intermountain West, if I'm getting 6 to 8% phosphorus in most of those animals, you're going to have them supplemented adequately on a 4-ounce mineral intake. You can see animals that are getting no supplementation that have marginally deficient phosphorus status if you actually look at bone phosphorus content. Phosphorus is not one that you can measure readily in tissues. Serum fluctuates with diet. Liver fluctuates with diet, but not to a great degree. It's held fairly constant in tissues. And so you actually have to analyze bone to determine true status in groups of animals. And unless you're following animals to kill, you're not going to get that type of information. Low magnesium, most of the time when I see low magnesium, I'm dealing with grass tetany. And you're dealing with just inappropriate ratios of potassium, magnesium, and calcium in that early lush growth grass forages. Michelle Whiteside asked if I could send my presentation. There is nothing in my presentation that's proprietary. One of the things I love about Huvepharma is they do let me continue to be involved in the realm of vitamin minerals, even though they are not in that arena. That That means I'm actually a third party, unbiased, and not focused on anybody's supplementation plan, and can truly provide educational information and not have anybody feel like it's biased towards anybody's product. I've seen some great products fail miserably, and I've seen products that I couldn't explain why they worked that still worked. I've seen about every spectrum that you can see out there in the industry. I'd be glad to share my presentation. I always caution people when I share my presentation. It is the bullet points, but it doesn't give the stories between the bullet points.
Yep.
I have a question, Dr. Hall. So, you wrote down that like when you see the vaccine reaction, like knots on the side of the neck, that's you said usually copper or zinc deficiency. That's what you've observed.
Okay, now I'm talking about the fluid-filled swelling. Knots
Right.
sometimes can be irritation. You can have some vaccine products that can be irritating and cause scar tissue, but just the fluid-filled that generally drain with lymphatic drainage and go away in a week or 10 days.
Okay.
Generally, you're going to find either a copper deficiency or a zinc deficiency. I'll give you two examples. I had a veterinarian in Arkansas that heard me talk about this, and about a month later, he called me and he goes, "I saw exactly what you described. We got a bunch of high-risk feeder calves from the sale barn. I went through, processed everything. The next day, the owner called me. He said, we had lumps the size of baseballs and softballs on the side of their neck." I said, "Did you get me some liver biopsies?" He said, "No." And I explained to the owner what it likely was. They wouldn't let me take any. He said, "But I did the next best thing." And I said, "Well, what's that?" He said, "I followed them through their 120-day backgrounding period." He said 100% of the calves they had to pull and medicate were the same ones that had those swelling reactions. I thought, that's interesting. Had a veterinarian in Idaho call me with a fairly similar description. He did send me some biopsies. I had 6 biopsies from this group of calves. He sent them to me blind. I had one that had a liver copper of 17, one that had a liver copper of 18. I consider those mildly deficient. I had one that had a liver copper of 9 and one that was 11. I call those significantly deficient. And then I had one that had a liver copper of 2 and a liver copper of 3. There's almost nothing left. And I sent him the results. I'd asked him to measure them. I was looking for enough data to where I could eventually get this published. And he said there's almost a direct linear correlation between the severity of the deficiency and the size of the swelling. I said, "Well, send me the measurements." He said, "Oh, I can tell them to you." He said the ones that were 17 and 18 were goose egg size. The ones that were 9 and 11 were softball size. And the ones that was liver copper of 2 and 3 were volleyball size. I said, "How many inches or centimeters?" He goes, "Oh, I didn't measure them that way." It's not like you can publish that kind of information. But there was a direct relationship. Like I say, there's not great research in ruminants to show the increased mast cells, but the fact that I see it routinely in various parts of the United States, and then when they do test, I do find those deficiencies, and the fact that it has been shown in other species tends to point to be as a high probability.
Then I guess I have one more question. Any strategies for helping those producers is there anything you would suggest, I guess, maybe, or a product or something to help those producers going up into those mountain ranges that aren't going to see those cows and provide that mineral supplementation? Any strategies you suggest?
The big thing that I suggest, and I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to have to get away from my norm because I'm going to have to mention a specific product just because there's limitations. I try to stay away from anybody's product, but that way I stay neutral. The first thing I tell people is make sure that they are on a real good supplementation program before you take them up the mountain. That way they have body reserves to get them through. On young calves, where they're growing rapidly and getting very little in the diet for several months, even if their livers are really good before you take them up, they're going to come off the mountain deficient. In those cases, I've had a number of people to where I tell them, think of their body reserves as a bucket. You have so much dribbling in at the top, and you've got a hole in the bottom of the bucket, and you've got so much dribbling out. You need enough coming in to keep that bucket from running out to where what's coming out is not causing a drop in the level of that bucket. even though they're on a really good plan, if the bucket's pretty full right before you haul them up the mountain, give them something that's going to bump that to where the reserves are slightly higher. So in those situations, I do recommend using an injectable mineral to fill their bucket a little bit more before they go up the mountain. Now, chances are they're still going to come off the mountain, sometimes marginally to slightly deficient, but they're not going to be as bad as if you'd not filled their bucket up a little fuller before they went up. And I've found that to be fairly successful. I mean, the better thing is to have a way to get the mineral up the mountain to them, but that's not always feasible. I prefer dietary to the injectable sources. That's just me personally. But there are times that the injectable is going to give you a benefit. The other time I typically talk about using injectables is when you get into those high risk, high stress calves, those lightweight, high risk calves. Assume they're deficient because chances are they are. Feeding them just a dietary, even if you feed them at 150 to 200% of NRC, it's going to take them a few weeks to get back up to normal. They're not going to get back up to normal immediately. By giving them an injectable and getting it into their system faster, it allows to start stimulating some of those enzyme systems faster than relying exclusively on a dietary. And I've found that to be successful in some of those real high risk, lightweight calves where they're coming in deficient. You want to get them back into a normal range faster. You're going to do that with an injectable faster than you are with dietary. And I did manage to stay away from trade name.
Any other questions? I'm not seeing any others come in, so I think we'll kind of end here for the day. I want to thank Dr. Van Emon and Dr. Hall for their time this afternoon, for presenting some timely, pertinent information, and really appreciate you taking the time to do that for us. And on behalf of the Northwest chapter of the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists, again, we thank you and for all of those that have participated here today. And as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of our inaugural kind of webinar series, and we hope to do this kind of on a regular basis so that members and just people that are interested can get some information that can help them in their situations, and also help them get some CEUs for ARPAS credit. So with that, I think we'll end here for the day. And again, just a word of thanks to the two of you for presenting information here today and helping make our first webinar series, I think, a success. So thank you very much.